I thought it would be a good idea right now to remind you all of something that was said by a young European mid laner a little more than a year ago, right before the mid-season invitational, in an interview with my then colleague. What he said was extremely controversial. He was immediately mocked and ridiculed. There were actually probably even threats of harm, people saying that they wished ill will on him for making this comment, and the comment was really simple. It was, I don't think Asian mid laners are better than European ones. He didn't say that Asian mid laners are trash, you know? He didn't say that European mid laners are gonna full stop dumpster Asian ones. He didn't even say, you know, Korean specifically. He said Asian. So just generally speaking, he was making a very broad comparison and saying that it's not necessarily the case that the best mid laner in a group of mid laners is going to be Chinese or Korean or Taiwanese or whatever. It could theoretically be European mid. I mean, in retrospect, this is not an offensive statement. This is not a statement that you automatically have to react to very negatively or anything like this. It seemed very logical because there's like, yeah, sure, you can come up with cultural reasons why we generally assume that Korean players have certain advantages in learning the game. We say their solo queue's better, whatever. There have been all sorts of theory and postulation, but when you get right down to it, there's no genetic reason, right, that a Korean player is just going to be objectively the best. Because it's gotten to the point where the assumption is the best player in a position is the player in that position on the best team, right? That's the assumption that we tend to make, and then you go down the list from there. Like when SKT were just really unbeatable and on top, people made outrageous claims like, oh, it just so happens that SK Telecom has the best top laner in the world, the best jungler in the world, the best mid laner in the world, the best AD carry in the world, the best support in the world. I really heavily disagree with that because I feel like this is the same kind of assumption that people make for like the all LCS awards, right? Like people just assumed that all of Fnatic were the best players in Europe, when that was pretty clear that that wasn't the true. As the split progressed, when you look back to some of Brox's pathing and things in retrospect, when people started examining this, it was just very clear that that was not the case. And I think the danger of passing this kind of judgment is just making the assumption that what is winning games is having the best player in every position, when I feel like over time, it's become very, very clear that that is not what is winning the games. It's not just that the players are overall better, they're doing things in the games that's better. And that was something that Perkz ended up saying, you know, after he experienced international competition, after he played against a bunch of other mid laners, is that he said, I kind of actually now think that a lot of the Asian mids are better, but that's not because of individual skill or anything, it's not because of talent, it's because we're behind in some of the decision-making elements. So when that is the conclusion, you then begin to ask, okay, what do we mean when we say individual skill? Like, this player is better than this player. This is a really good question, okay? Because I think decision-making is a big part of it, and making the right decision in the right circumstances. And some of these things are, yeah, you're playing Korean solo queue all the time, and people who've played Korean solo queue say that there's like much more elements of team playing Korean solo queue. Obviously, I never have, so I can't really speak to that. So this will train you and put you in the same situation so that your reactions are just better over time. But there are a lot of things that make reactions good, right? You can kind of surround yourself with good play, or to the best of your ability in your own region. You can put yourself in a lot of situations. You can do in-houses. You can just kind of get to the point where you're training decision-making over and over anyway. And you get to this sort of threshold where I feel like improvement in individual skill is kind of like, just really like it plateaus a little bit, or its marginal rate of return is lower. So the individual skill gap might be smaller, and it's just the big decisions, the big team decisions that you're really behind on. Like, you don't understand how to use side waves after a certain point in the game, or you don't understand how to coordinate to set up for Baron in this particular play. Like, you're not bouncing the wave correctly here, and you're not putting the vision behind the Baron in the right place. So I think that at a point, it comes down to like team decision making, and unpacking that from individual skill gets to a point where it's really hard. I think one of the best examples of this year is Ambition and Crown and Haru. Because I think that the real way to sort of see where Crown was struggling in summer, and to really see that Crown was struggling, is if you look at the way Haru plays, and it isn't really different. He still will invade against pressure, or he'll invade when his mid doesn't have a good matchup, and you have to invade when your mid is pushing, right? Because then you have the mid laner is able to respond faster without losing experience, without falling behind. Okay, so this is really fundamental. And Haru, I think, got a lot of praise for really kind of ballsy, daring sort of moves that people didn't expect. And then Crown started to struggle, and you could really kind of see where Haru was getting caught more, where Haru didn't have the best decision making, and Ambition came in and he started doing this thing that was really helpful to Samsung, which was he had a very good sense for when mid would lose pressure or when Crown would be struggling, and he'd go mid and he'd help mid push, okay? And then reset the wave, and then Crown could get a good back, and the lane would be better overall. Samsung had a better time overall. So you could see that the difference in how the jungle played with the mid laner reflected how the mid laner was doing individually. So for me, I think that this is the type of thing that you can look at, like how the team is responding to deficiency, that kind of points out where maybe some of the gaps are. If we're talking about individual skill in terms of being able to lane against or compete against some of the best, like you legitimately see LMS and LPL players who are able to play Korean solo queue whenever. You legitimately see these kinds of players climbing up to the top of the LCK, or not the LCK, the South Korean ladder, right? They will hold number one for periods of time. Players like Xiao who have held number one, for example. I think that if given a certain amount of time, it's very obvious that some of these European or North American players would be able to climb to this number one spot with a certain number of perseverance. So is how you do in solo queue at all a measure of individual skill? I think it is. I think it's not as good of a measure of decision making or team play, but I think it's a fairly decent measure of how mechanically gifted you can be in the game. Like, not to go too LS, but the ability to control your champion to get it to do what you want it to do is actually a super simple concept, and it's just like the mechanics of the game, and being individually skilled, mechanics is part of it. And when we rank individual skill, I think there are some inconsistencies in how we rank domestic players and how we compare them to foreign players, right? And one of those inconsistencies is a lot of the stuff that we fall back on, and a lot of the stuff we really look at to measure and say for the be-all end-all of how good this player is at learn doesn't really stack up when we look at international competition. It doesn't really put the LCK players on top at all, right? First of all, when you talk to players from LCK, LPL, LMS, NA, EU, whatever, they will say that they use laning a lot to measure the individual skill of the opponent that they're playing against. They say this because a lot of times you can't really tell what calls outside of laning phase are the players and what are his teams, right? Top laners to an extent, TPs, because usually top lane's called TP. There are a bunch of other factors like mid lane roams and things like this that I think you can kind of gauge that this is something the player does. Engages, right? Some engages are so reactive that they have to be the call of the player making the engage. But, okay, overall, people will say laning is the best metric for judging individual skill, or players will say this. I don't necessarily think that that's always the case, but I think that there's some merit to the argument, and as a result, people put a lot of weight on laning, and so people try to come up with statistics to measure laning because we don't have individual player streams. We can't watch like every laning decision a player makes, so we have to try to come up with some sort of metrics or some sort of measure. It's like, oh, this lane is pushed out here in this matchup, he shouldn't necessarily be winning it, or he should be winning it. So these are all measures of how well this player is laning. You notice these patterns over time. You notice the position of the jungler and the position of the rest of the players on the map and how they're doing this, and this is sort of how you start to be able to judge laning. But of course, like, one of the more shorthand ways is to use some sort of statistic, and people are like really fascinated with this CS difference at 10 stat that we think is the be-all end-all of measuring laning phase domestically. And it's like, oh, obviously on average this stat is really high, so this guy must be a good laner. I personally think CS difference at 10 is not really a reliable measure of laning. play at all. Because some teams will prioritize having winning matchups all the time. Some teams will have mid pressure all the time. So as a top laner against a team with a mid that will go off to the side bush or something and generate some sort of level of pressure, you can't play aggressively. You fall behind. Things like this, all of this will impact your ability to get a CS lead at 10 minutes or what have you. So I don't necessarily think this is the best measure of stats, but people like dogmatically swear by this to the point where it's like, well, his CS difference at 10, he has the best laning stats, right? So obviously he's the best laner. But when you look, when you look at international tournaments that we've had in the past few years, the best player with the highest CS difference at 10, so I mean the player with the best highest CS difference at 10 is not an LCK player. It's actually very rare that there's like more than 2 even in the top 10. In the 2015 Worlds, this is an exception. Faker was number 1, but after that, there wasn't another one in the top 10. There wasn't another LCK player in the top 10, despite like how dominantly SKT did at that event. Right? Pretty shocking when you think about how much we put stock into this to tell us like how good at laning players are, and LCK players don't typically have high CS difference at 10 at international events. Traditionally, LCK teams haven't really prioritized laning. Just in general, like CS difference at 10, sure isn't the most be-all end-all, but they don't necessarily prioritize getting this really big laning lead. Also, like in the 2016 World Championship final, 2 games, I think it was, that there was a lead at 10 minutes by the team that eventually won, and only 2 of the 5 games. So in 3 of the 5 games, the game was won by the team that was losing at 10 minutes, theoretically. So this is the fascinating thing, is that like LCK teams and players don't necessarily have good laning phase. And the reason why people rate Longzhu so highly, okay, here's the secret, right? Longzhu dropped winning lane matchups. Yeah, it's pretty insane. You look at these top 20 lists, right? And the best player that everyone agrees that SKT is probably going to win Worlds, okay? But they still will put 4 out of 5 Longzhu players on their list. They'll still put more Longzhu players on their list than they will put SKT players, because Longzhu players do better in lane because they prioritize laning in their drafting and the way that they play. This is really rare, especially now, because people are going to tank jungle, people are going to tank top, and they're playing these Cinder Hulk meta things, at least in the meta leading up to Worlds. They're playing Cinder Hulk, they're playing all these tanks, they're teamfighting a ton, so people aren't necessarily prioritizing 1-3-1 comps, because 1-3-1 comps are easy to screw up. And if you ask people why 1-3-1 comps are easy to screw up, they'll say something like, unless you snowball your top laner really, really hard, it's difficult to execute. Yeah, that's true, but that is not the hard part, okay? If you have a really good winning top lane matchup like Jace or something in an aggressive jungle, you can camp lane and get far ahead to a certain reasonable extent. Even if you don't get a lot of ganks off, you'll probably be winning lane pretty well, because this matchup is really punishing. And if you have an aggressive jungle, the enemy top laner can't even play that aggressively against you anyway. So that's not the difficult part, okay? Khan's job is not the job that's the hard one. The reason why 1-3-1 comps are difficult to execute is because it's hard to hold mid with fewer people against tanks. Tanks will just flank you if you don't have good vision. They'll beat you up with a numbers advantage, and it doesn't matter how far ahead your top laner is, you just lost Baron, right? That definitely is a big issue with executing 1-3-1 comps. So I give more credit to the players who are holding mid than I do to Khan, generally, with his strategy and the fact that they can carry out this 1-3-1. But the point is that Longzhu players draft to have winning lane matchups. They draft to be able to carry out these 1-3-1s with like champions like Talia, with champions like Dahlia, with champions like Jace. And so naturally their laning stats and how they look in laning is going to look better. It just is. It's just like the way it is. And so we rate the Longzhu players so highly because they're playing these winning lane matchups, they're doing super well, and they look really good. I mean, it's just that simple. So if you're playing like winning lane matchups, you have a high CS difference at 10, and you're not like making simple screw up errors and you're highly mechanically skilled, you're gonna look like a good player. And that's what happens at Worlds 2 when you have Western teams going up against LCK players? Like, where it's really easy for us to forget, like, how long the list of players who have solo killed Faker is. Like, Febevin, Perks, Xiaohu, Jesus, I mean, it's actually kind of long and I don't really want to list it. The point is that people do well in lane, players do well in lane individually against LCK players. The problem is not the individual skill, and so saying something like Bjergsen is a really good mid laner and could theoretically be better than BDD in versatility and well-roundedness, whatever, isn't that controversial a statement. Perk saying that Asian mids aren't better than EU mids isn't that controversial a statement. I actually think it's really interesting that this is what the default has come to, is that people actually think that LCK teams are winning just because their players are just better. And it's not just because they have like really good players in a couple of positions and then their team play is really good. I mean, I think that generally, if you're at Worlds, you're probably, like, we've gotten good enough at talent distribution on teams, just internationally, that you're probably a good player. And there's an effect of being on a good team that's winning that makes you really motivated to keep working hard, to keep working well, and to not be the reason that this team is held back in some way. Because if you're doing well, like, theoretically, the sky's the limit, right? So you'll get an individual boost for being on this good team and all this other stuff. So theoretically, if you're going to Worlds, you should be a good player. Just once you get to that point, how we measure individual skill becomes, like, slightly more nitpicky, and the reason for failure is just much more down to the decision making we make, and cutting the difference between decision making and individual skill and deciding what makes a player good, what makes a player great, becomes difficult. And I don't think that LCK has the best top 3 players in every position at Worlds. I don't.